Chris, Matthew, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today. And it is the day that Jeremy Corbyn is launching Labour's European elections manifesto. And I just want to try on you a line that he's launching this with. He's saying what divides us isn't Europe, it's all the things that used to divide us, working conditions, pay, the rest of it. Is he right? Chris, Matthew.
I suppose no and yes, in the sense that to suggest that the major political divide is simply the old political divide, in a sense the class divide, is nonsense in a number of ways. I mean, first, it's nonsense in terms of actual voting patterns. So if you go back to the 1970s, Labour had a lead in terms of working class to middle class voters of 4-1, but there was no difference in terms of age voting. In the last election, I think Labour had a lead of 4-1 amongst young people, but there was no difference in class affiliation. So class has just about disappeared as the foundation for people's voting behaviours. So in that sense, it's not true. That's not how the country is divided politically. But also in terms of the issues that matter to people, what we've clearly got in this country, as we have all around the world, is a kind of matrix of traditional socioeconomic concerns and then a set of kind of cultural identity concerns. And what our political parties are having to cope with, what political parties around the world are having to cope with, is this divide, because yes, there is a group of people that Labour can appeal to on that kind of traditional basis of caring about inequality, believing in the public sector, wanting a stronger state, more redistribution. But there's also a large group of people who believe that, but they also are people who are hostile to immigration, hostile to kind of political correctness and what they would call identity politics, hostile to Europe. And the Conservative Party has always had a very similar kind of difference between the kind of liberal free marketeers on the one hand and the social conservatives on the other. And Europe has kind of cuts across that and reinforces that. So I'm afraid the attempt to reassert the politics of the past, I mean, it may work as a device. It's not sociologically very soundly based.
Is he right, Chris?
No, I don't think he is. I mean, I can see why he's saying it, obviously, and as Matthew says, maybe it'll work as a device in the moment to try and get through sort of these next few weeks in European elections. But I think it is no more than a device, and I'm sort of reflect on, when I was advising the Prime Minister in number 10, we used to talk sort of on the flip side, we used to talk about actually the things that unite us are greater than things that divide us. So actually let's look beyond Brexit, and if we talk about all these other things about education and things like this, then actually the Conservative Party can come together around those things, even if Brexit is a sort of divisive issue. So we were sort of trying a sort of similar thing in the reverse. But I think Matthew's absolutely right, that you can't look, I think, at any of the recent elections or any of the polling that's done at the moment and say that there isn't a fundamental change in the way that people identify with politics and with political parties. And this is the great issue that neither of the two established parties really have any signs of beginning to get to grips with. And they're still sort of framing it all around this very traditional way of viewing politics. And so that's probably a large part of the reason why we're in the mess we're in.
So the party that would be most successful right now would be a party that was economically of the left and culturally and socially of the right. That's what people want. You see various attempts to adopt that position.
Well, you were part of one of those, weren't you, Chris? Isn't that what Theresa May was kind of doing at the very beginning?
Well, yes. I mean, to a degree, that's true. I was just thinking, as Matthew was saying, that this is exactly the debate in the Conservative Party now is that the Conservative Party, some people say, should become a sort of a national party. It should exactly be sort of left to the left economically, to the right culturally, and there were definitely elements of that about the original sort of Mayism, if I can use that phrase, when the Prime Minister got into number 10. But there was always a tension between that and the voting coalition that had got the Conservatives into power just a couple of years before, when David Cameron put together a coalition which was rather more liberal, more urban, more metropolitan. What we were trying to do was actually say, let's lock in the David Cameron coalition and then sort of build out from there. And ultimately that maybe was something that was maybe doomed to failure, but it was something that I think we had to try and do as we tried to grapple with a really unique set of circumstances after the referendum.
And I think what makes this more adds to the complexity is that kind of left of centre socioeconomic agenda is quite policy rich. There's lots of things you can do. You can renationalise the railways, or you can put more money to public spending. You can get rid of the internal market in the NHS. What you do on the kind of social conservative cultural side, in policy terms, is much less clear. So obviously you've got Brexit, but you can crack down on immigration, okay, but actually immigration has gone down way down in salience in terms of public attitudes. Law and order, well, actually, although people have Daily Mail instincts, the fact of the matter is, we've got a pretty grim prison system. No one's going to talk about making it grimmer. You can maybe increase police numbers a bit, but there isn't really much of a policy agenda there. We don't have the issues they have in America, abortion, for example, which is, Trump is now beginning to really motor on abortion. Because in a sense, part of the problem is you want to appeal to that group. You need some policy issues. You need some policy meat to reinforce that distinction. And it's not so clear what those issues would be in a British context.
It's not, and I suppose immigration is the one that has sort of played that role in a sense. And I think it's a sort of misfortune really that the Prime Minister has currently been defined in many ways by her response to that issue, because I would argue that she's done so many sort of good things and socially reforming things around sort of race relations and things like this. This work she did at the Home Office when she first got to number 10, establishing the social disparity audit and sort of recognising the way public services discriminate against BME communities. So she's done a lot there, but the moment you start talking about immigration, it really starts to colour the view that people have of you as a politician and about your agenda generally. So thinking back to those days in number 10, I think of things that we tried to do that were about embracing a more sort of open, sort of tolerant society, that were sort of outward looking. But then there'd always be something about immigration that would come along and would sort of completely wipe out sort of everything that we tried to do on that front, because immigration is one of these issues that just everyone gets sort of emotionally wound up about, and it comes to colour sort of the way everything's seen. So, embracing that issue to try and embrace that sort of culturally sort of right-wing agenda, I think feeds into everything else you try to do then, and it becomes something that damages your agenda.
We'll come back to some of the specific stuff about today and the political climate right now. But what you were saying, Matthew, about the idea that you need to be a party economically of the left and socially of the right, that's a sort of, isn't what you're saying there? You need to be anti-globalization or tapping into anti-globalization or hostility or fear of globalization. And basically everything that Blair embraced.
Yes, I think there's certainly a turn against globalization. There's an economic turn, one doesn't know exactly what game Trump is playing and cranking up the hostility towards the Chinese ahead of these talks. And I think, we have a global economic system which is more fragile, I think, than people realise. And if these Chinese-American talks really do break down, it could well precipitate something quite nasty, I think. So you've got globalization in retreat at the kind of economic level, at the objective level. But clearly, yes, people feel, on the one hand, kind of less enthusiastic about it. And also, I think they're less willing to be told it's an inevitability, that there's nothing that you can do about it, that it's a kind of unstoppable force. So,
which was Tony Blair's mantra, wasn't it? It was part of it. It's a modern age, we've got to go with it, we've got to run with it, make the best of it and the rest of it. In a sense, those are Macron's instincts as well. He's done better with them maybe in recent times.
Yeah, so I think, without going into a kind of over-complex kind of theory, one way of thinking about society is that in the end it's a kind of combination of the state, markets and civil society. Or another way of thinking about it, it's a combination of kind of authority, of values and of kind of individual aspirations. Now, what you saw with the kind of what the left calls neoliberalism, the dominant model from the 1970s until 2008, is really a kind of compromise between two of those forces. This is basically a deal between markets and the state. And the deal is this: if you let markets expand, you give markets free rein, you allow financial capitalism to kind of seep everywhere, then capitalism will generate growth, and with that growth, you can deal with some of the effects that are caused by capitalism, some of the problems that are generated by it. That was the grand deal. Now, what's missing in that is what I would call solidarity, or the kind of values bit. And so what you have is a kind of solidarity deficit. And what we have in our politics is a left and right account of that deficit. So the left says what's wrong with society is we've forgotten equality and justice. We have a society of elites who oppress minorities. But on the right, you have a similar account of this kind of solidarity, this values deficit. But for them, it's about nationhood, it's about belonging, it's about cohesion, it's about tradition, it's about the tribe. And this is a very visceral politics, actually, that's unfolding. And the kind of turn against globalization is driven by both sides, but in different ways. So the left has a kind of critique of financial globalization, the power of major corporations. And the right has a critique of it in terms of national interest and nasty foreigners behaving unfairly. But yes, does that mean that globalization is in question in a way that it wasn't for 20 or 30 years? Absolutely.
You're nodding, Chris.
Yes, I mean, I think the word Matthew just used, belonging, this word is, I think, going to come to define politics, certainly on the right, but maybe politics as a whole for a number of years now, and it is that sense of to what do you belong, and you know, where is your sort of focus point? So yes, for many on the right of politics, it is the nation, but actually, when you drill down beneath that, you know, what drove so much of the vote for Brexit during the referendum was a sense of a lack of belonging to my local environment. And you know, when you look around and see your sort of high street boarded up and things like this, then all those ties that sort of bind sort of begin to sort of slip away. So belonging is a word that you hear talked about quite a lot on the sort of centre right now at the moment. But I think the other thing I'd say though, just on this, what really interests me, I suppose, is the role that of leadership and communication in this, and that's what you know, so many of these debates come down to, which is when you're talking about should the Conservative Party become sort of the national party, what you're really saying is, should we look at the state of society and what people are saying and say, well, that's what people are saying, so therefore we must follow them and sort of embrace that? Or are you saying, actually, in politics we think we should fight for these things over here, and leadership is about sort of making the argument? And I think for many years what Tony Blair did was very successfully actually take people with him by making an argument demonstrating leadership, and then we sort of know what happened and his sort of credibility fell away. But actually what I think we're lacking now generally is people prepared to stake out a position and argue for it. And there's, I think, rather too much of looking at things saying, well, this is how things are, and therefore we must go in this direction, which is quite a depressing way of thinking about politics, I think.
I mean, I certainly think leadership is a fascinating question right now. And, you know, I think it's partly that the parties are ungovernable, our political parties are ungovernable. But there is also, you're right, absolutely, Chris, that we don't have leaders who either want to or have the capacity to transcend that. I mean, Margaret Thatcher managed to hold together a basically incoherent ideological position of support for kind of libertarian market economy with a kind of socially conservative worldview. I mean, it didn't make any kind of sense at all, but she had the capacity and the self-confidence and the luck in some ways to be able to pull off this sort of strange position. Now, when she goes, it starts to be exposed because actually the kind of values of the big bang in the city and loads of money and all of that was clearly inimical to some of the other values that she asserted as a social conservatism. So great leaders, one of the characteristics of great leaders is the capacity to hold together kind of positions in tension. Now, we don't have that kind of leadership. So it's probably, if you look at the Labour Party right now, for me, the fundamental problem of the Labour Party is Jeremy Corbyn, there's no question. I think partly because of people moving to change, so the very Blairite wing of the Labour Party kind of walking away, actually most people in the Labour Party would be willing to accept the more radical version of kind of social democracy, democratic socialism that is offered by kind of John McDonnell and people around him. So I don't actually think would be, apart from Brexit, of course, massive disunity in the Labour Party. It would be a kind of Kinnockite, early Kinnock kind of leftist position. Yeah, it's perfectly respectable. And actually, in many ways, as we were saying earlier, the public is more sympathetic to some of those ideas than they've been for a long time. The idea of the state playing a bigger role in the economy, for example. But the problem is that Jeremy Corbyn is not really up to the job that he's got. He doesn't seem to have the kind of energy for it. He doesn't seem to have the engagement with it. And as a result, he has a group of people around him who are highly protective and highly centralised. So if you talk to people in the Labour Party, their relationship with the centre is one of kind of fear and despair. So that's what you've got going on in the Labour Party. I think if the Labour Party had a different leader, it wouldn't actually need to change its political position very much to have the support of nearly all its MPs and nearly all its activists.
On the economic domestic front.
Take Brexit, yeah, and that would go with, because that's Corbyn's obsession, of course. Some of that would go with Corbyn as well. So there is a kind of tacit consensus within the Labour Party for a more left-wing version of its programme than it's had since the kind of mid-80s. But that isn't expressing itself as a united party, clear and determined and optimistic, because it has a leader who doesn't really have the right characteristics of leadership and who is surrounded by people who make other people feel angry and frightened. Now, in the Conservative Party, I'll hand over to you, Chris, you have a very different kind of leadership problem. And I just want to throw in here, and it's kind of interesting looking at Vince Cable. I mean, Vince Cable has had a terrible time as leader, but he's kind of stuck away at it. Yeah. He's not, he's just plodded away, done the right thing, made speeches, And then it's quite nice in a way, isn't it, to see that at the end, getting towards the end of his time, he's having a little bit of a spurt that, maybe just standing there and saying what you believe, and it does pay off eventually. He done well in the local elections. I'm sure they'll do quite well in the European elections. So, but as for Conservative leadership, that's your area.
Indeed. Yes, and I think, just to pick up on that, I think, the Conservative Party's good fortune at the moment. One thing is that Jeremy Corbyn is the Labour leader, because I think if they had a different leader, we'd be in even more trouble than we are now. But we're clearly going to move into a leadership election at some point in the next few months, to be determined when. And we could have a field of up to sort of 10 or more people in that. But it's going to be, hopefully, I think, an opportunity for the party to really think about some of these questions. I think that what we really need is that lengthy process to allow the party to have a debate about where it wants to go.
Do they look in reflective, calm mode at the moment to you, or are they going to hit the panic button?
Well, I think it depends on the way the whole thing is set up. And actually, I think what the Prime Minister needs to do, and she's obviously considering at the moment exactly how this plays out, but actually, the service that she can give to the Conservative Party now is to set up a process which allows for time for both a proper debate about the kind of party we want to be, how we're going to resolve some of these issues that we've been talking about, but also gives an opportunity for the sort of full generation, next generation of talent to have a voice in that as well, which is effectively what Michael Howard did when he handed over the leadership some years ago.
How do you do that if the Brexit clock is still ticking and the issue hasn't been resolved? I mean, aren't you almost saying the same thing as Jeremy Corbyn this morning, which is, wouldn't it be great if we didn't have to talk about Brexit and we could talk about everything else? But the reality
it's not going to be that kind of contest.
The reality is going to be a contest in which I've assumed that every Conservative candidate has to pretend they're going to go to Europe and get a better deal, apart from kind of maybe one or two.
They're all going to attack that way, aren't they, Chris?
I mean, they're all going to attack that way to different degrees, and some more closely sort of embracing the no deal scenario or whatever. I mean, absolutely, of course. I mean, Brexit's going to overshadow it, but at the moment we're in a period where we have the extension till the end of October. It's not ideal. I'm not suggesting it is, but I think we do need to find a way to have a contest that allows us to talk about some of these other issues as well, and that means taking time to do it properly, I think, rather than sort of rushing into a change of leadership.
Because once the contest has actually started, I have to say.
It has started, but the formal process, because once we choose a new leader now, as we've seen, once you've got a leader, they are there for as long as pretty much they want to be. And if we don't take this opportunity, I think, to really tease out some of these these issues as a party, where do we really want to sit, what sort of party do we want to be, then it'll be a real wasted opportunity if we don't do that.
So something I don't understand, and I'm sure you can both help me with this, but I don't really understand now. The only route to a hard Brexit is a second referendum. It's not going to get through the House of Commons.
I agree.
Right? And those who advocate a hard Brexit are very fond of saying, as Boris said, that that's what most people want. So the question for me is, why is it that nobody who wants a hard Brexit is saying, okay, let's have bring it on, let's have a second referendum, okay? Now, there are two explanations to that. One is simply that they know they'll lose. Fine. The other is that what they're hoping is that there's a Tory leadership campaign that whoever wins it says, I'm going to Europe to demand a better deal. They go to Europe. Europe laughs in their face in the politest of manners. They come back and say, I've been insulted and we're going for a hard exit. But the problem with that is you're still not going to get it through the House of Commons.
So here's a couple of other scenarios. Having talked to some contenders recently and people who are supporting them within their teams and the rest of it, some people who will be doing part of that and already doing some of that sort of waving at the virtue signalling at the Conservative associations and saying, I'm more Brexity than anyone else and the rest of it. They're actually talking privately in the room with the teams around them about the idea of a second referendum for kind of the reason that Matthew says, because the other way out of the maze is blocked. They're not doing it with enthusiasm, but it would be that.
But it works for this is really interesting.
Referendum.
It works for Boris because Boris has never really wanted to leave the European Union. It's always been part of his grand plan. So for Boris, a second referendum is fine because if Remain wins it, that's fine because he never wanted to leave in the first place. And if a hard Brexit wins it, he can be the kind of Churchillian figure who gets us through the years of rationing. I mean, he can't lose. So I can see what that appeals. But at what point does that start to surface? That's what interests me because no one's saying it at the moment.
They're definitely not saying it, and they won't be saying it during the campaign either, I suspect. But one of the things Matthew was just talking about the very particular types of leaders. Let's talk about Boris for a bit. Types of leaders who can hold two completely opposite contentions in their head, and yet somehow the whole thing doesn't completely fall apart. Now he's going to campaign on very much a one nation sort of ticket, and in some ways that flies in the face of what a lot of Tories wanted from Brexit, which they would say it was good for the whole nation, but nonetheless it was a Singapore-style sort of leaner state and all the rest of it. I mean, is it possible that a Boris Prime Minister could be one of these sort of extraordinary phenomenons of charismatic leadership that you talk about, Matthew, who can hold opposite contentions together and actually run the thing and surprise us, and their optimism somehow carries them over all the cliffs and crevasses that Theresa May and Gordon Brown regularly fell into?
So I think the issue there for me is what is Boris's fundamental view of capitalism? I know that might sound like a rather abstruse way of looking at it, but I think that's the critical question. So as we said earlier, there is a perfectly coherent position, which is to say, to be more left of centre on the economy, to say actually we realise that the state does need a bigger role, and this is a government, for example, which has an industrial strategy and stuck to that industrial strategy, believes in it. It's taken on the recommendations that I made in a report for Theresa May and is strengthening worker protection. We're going to have one of the highest minimum wages in the world in a couple of years' time. So you can have that position, and you can have alongside it a kind of rhetoric of nationalism and a kind of you can be hostile to kind of political correctness and various things. You can kind of do that. That isn't an incoherent position. But if you're going to do that, you do need to be willing to take on capitalism. You need to be willing to take on the rich. Now, what you've seen with Trump is that Trump's position when he got to power was a bit like that. He was an economic populist and he did talk about the elites and all that. The second he got to power, all that kind of stuff went. His tax reforms were actually highly regressive. And he's the darling of big corporates in America, and the Dow Jones has done very well under him. So I think the question is, if Boris is really going to adopt that position, he would have to do things which the Conservative Party and which its business base would find uncomfortable.
Where's the money coming from?
Where's the money? He'd have to increase taxes. I think he would have to genuinely constrain.
Not just borrow.
No, so that's, I think, the interesting question. I think there is an intellectually coherent position there, but it is one which requires a Conservative leader. And don't forget that when Theresa May was slightly anti-business in her early, period, she got a lot of stick for it. There was a lot of pushback from people who said that, because this was the Nick Timothy position, was a kind of hostility to big business.
Maybe the Chris Wilkins one.
Well, I was definitely there at the time, and that was the case. And of course, the big sort of question, I guess, in the party as well. If you go down that route, which Theresa did, aren't you merely endorsing Corbynism? And if you're going to take that position, why wouldn't people just vote for the real thing in Jeremy Corbyn rather than the Conservatives, who will only ever get halfway there? And that was the sort of thing that was raised at the time. But I do think actually that more and more that sort of narrative that Theresa first talked about is being talked about in the party. It's not a sort of instinctively comfortable position for us to be in at times for all sorts of reasons. But
which leadership contender? Sorry, while we're speaking, Esther McVey has just announced that she's running for the leadership, even though there isn't actually a vacancy yet. So,
and Amber Rudd's making a big speech today, isn't she?
Colourful addition, yes. But who is being remotely open about that now in terms of raising taxes? Exactly what Matthew's talking about, where the money comes from to be more generous, to turn the taps on, as Tory MPs keep saying.
I mean, I think no one's been completely open about it, but there's a whole spectrum of potential candidates, from sort of David Gauke and Amber Rudd on the one side through to
have you just announced another candidate?
Esther McVey and Liz Truss at sort of the other end of the candidate, all are being talked about as potential candidates. And this is the big question that the party needs to face up to, which is exactly why we need to take the time to have this kind of debate. And I think actually once you go below cabinet rank as well, and you look at some of the people coming up through the party, there's some really interesting thinking going on. There's some very talented people at that level having these kind of debates, and that's what we need to actually allow to come to the surface through this process. We can't make this leadership contest all about Brexit, even though it's clearly going to dominate. We need to take the opportunity to have that bigger discussion.
I'm reading Matthew's face. It looks like good luck with that.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I think in a sense it's a little bit like the kind of flip side of the birth of New Labour. So, the kind of Clinton, Blair, Schroeder in Germany, that whole kind of new progressivism was an attempt by people on the left to accommodate themselves to neoliberalism and to say, okay, how do we soften the edges of what seems to be the kind of dominant system? We seem to have cracked it in terms of an economic model which generates growth year on year on year. And, why would we want to interfere with that? And anyway, to do so would be incredibly risky. So we just have to that's what we have to adapt to. And that's what you, in a way, and also adapt to other aspects of modernity, the rise of individualism, things like that. Now, it seems that the Conservative Party is having a similar kind of conversation. It'll be less kind of intellectually the left they love ideas.
Love isms.
So there isn't a kind of Anthony Giddens figure on the right who's the third way and all of that kind of stuff. But nevertheless, what Chris is talking about is a party that is saying, look, we can feel the mood out there. We understand that what people feel is that inequality and injustice is wrong, that young people are having a raw deal. We can see what's happening to our own children and to their friends. And our politics has got to speak to that. A politics that says, well, no, rising tide lifts all boats, inequality doesn't matter, places that are falling behind just have to kind of adapt. Is not going to wash anymore. So it's a very interesting, interesting moment. In some ways it's a pity that, and I understand exactly your point now, Chris, it's just a pity, which is this is quite a rich conversation to be having, but unfortunately it's probably going to be overshadowed by the B word.
And well, let's bring it back to that, because you've talked about how the Labour Party might remain viable, strong, capable of coming into government, maybe with a different leader in your view, but maybe in the same sort of bit of political terrain. You're talking about the sort of thought processes that could lead the Conservative Party to revival. Now let's deal with where we really are now. Put aside the dreams. How close are we to a serious political rupture, a moment that feels like a new sort of dark age in our politics? Matthew?
Well, I mean, in a way, we're living through it. We are. These are remarkable times, and there is a kind of volatility to what is happening. I'm not sure how the system ruptures. I mean, in a way, that's almost a problem. The problem is that our electoral system, the way that Parliament works, we are in this position where actually things are holding together even as they fall apart. It's a kind of that's the strangeness of it. If things are really to fall apart, all the bits went up in the air and we could reinvent our political parties, and who knows what happened. But there are very strong powers of inertia in this system, which is what we're finding with Theresa May. I mean, I think anyone would have thought to have a leader of a party who is openly despised by most of their members of parliament and not really liked by their party members, and who is has just got 20, just been completely mullered in the local elections, is going to have one of the worst ever national result in the European elections, but is able to kind of really just carry on. I mean, that's the interest. They don't underestimate those powers of inertia. So you don't think we're going to lurch towards authoritarianism or something like that? You're aware of all the stuff that's being downfall of the West literature that's been pouring out, and everybody's staring into the looking glass. You think it holds together? It's a really bad bug rather than a chronic disease. Well, no, I'm not being complacent in any way, because I think things are bad, and I think things can move very quickly. Once things start to get articulated on the street, as we saw with the Gilets jaunes in France, once that genie is out of the bottle. Now, none of this has ever, so far, it's not really expressed itself as civil disobedience and people fighting on the streets. If that happened, then it would take on a different kind of complexion. But no, I think in a way the problem is our capacity to sustain kind of incoherence, chaos, division, a government that in many ways isn't really functioning very much, and just kind of carry on with it, And this is something we've noticed. I mean, Belgium, Belgium went on for a government, went on for 2 years without a government. Italy was ungovernable for a long period of time. Places do kind of they do carry on. So I suppose my point would be, it's a crisis, not a new era. Then, well, I don't know what the moment is and the mechanism is whereby all of this stuff turns into a kind of civil disorder, and I think it carries on until, actually I'm sort of with Chris on this, until an act of leadership. I think really you dribble on until a leader comes through. Now the danger is that is a populist leader. The danger is a kind of a credible Farage, who is able to burst through. But even they would have the problem that you need a political party behind you. Yeah. You need a majority in the House of Commons. So our institutions, in a way, are the thing. Our institutions have got us here, but they're also the thing that hold us in this position of status. It's going to hold together, Chris?
I just have a sense that actually it's more about how the existing structures and political parties respond to that. And ultimately, does come back to leadership. Is somebody going to step forward and say, actually, here's my position, here's how I want to sort of bring these things together, and follow me, and actually I can get us through this sort of mess, and get back to some stability. In a really, really sort of different circumstance, but from the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party a few years ago was not in a great place, and David Cameron stepped forward and he said, here I am, this is what I believe in, follow me. And the Conservative Party said, okay, well, we'll do that. And, they went on to win elections, it sort of worked out okay. Now, very, very different circumstances, but I just believe that actually within the system, there are people and there are potential leaders who can step forward, respond to some of the broader issues, but actually lead us out of sort of the morass that we've got ourselves into. But it does come down to politicians stepping up and taking that on.
And I think that is the thing that from a left of centre perspective is frustrating about the moment, which is that there's no question. There's a lot of ideas on the left. There's an intellectual renaissance. People are, we had John McDonnell at the RSA on Monday talking about basic income. Whatever you think of basic income, it's a big, bold idea, and an idea that's actually been supported by people on the right as well as the left. So there's an intellectual flowering taking place. So there's an interest in the left about technological change, which is interesting. A kind of utopianism that says, well, actually, if we really fully exploit this technology, we can create a much better society in many, many ways. So that's all happening. But unfortunately, because of the problem of Jeremy Corbyn's limitations as a leader and the control mechanisms around him, this isn't really being articulated to the public, because what the public can't do is they can't get round Corbyn and the sense, quite the sense that they've got, which is absolutely accurate, which is that his party is deeply uneasy, that the people around him, particularly in Parliament, are deeply uneasy with him as a leader. You both seem to be cultivating a bit of optimism, but at the same time, I can't help thinking the leader you least want, Chris, is probably going to
win the Tory leadership contest, and Matthew, that Jeremy Corbyn's going to be there for a while.
Yeah, no, I think that I think that's the case, and I think that's because partly because the left in the Labour Party, the hard left in the Labour Party, are aware that anyone other than Corbyn will inexorably move slightly more towards the mainstream in the centre, because that's just what you do in our electoral system, and they just want to resist that. And so there is no Corbynism without Corbyn, and so they will, I think, hold on to this for as long as they can, because once he's gone, in a way, normal service is resumed. Although
Thornburyism, or whatever.
Although of a more left-wing variety, because that's where the world is, and there's been a lot of thinking in the Labour Party. So I do think leadership's quite, historically, I think people look back and say the Labour Party had a winning hand, and it had a public that was receptive to it, but unfortunately, it had a leader who lacked credibility.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think on the Conservative side, I mean, whoever individually emerges to be the leader, I think the key question that they need to address, in a sense, of the Conservative Party is which election are we trying to win? Because the talk around becoming a national party and embracing kind of the current state of affairs, it might get you through the next election. You might limp over the line, but my view is that by going in that direction, you are basically disenfranchising the younger voters who are coming through now, who really aren't looking at the Conservative Party. So the election after that in 2027 or whenever it might be, you're setting yourselves up to fail then. So I would prefer to find somebody emerging who can actually have that sort of long view on things.
And what odds do you put on that?
What odds do I put on it? Well, let's say
your
50,
current
50.
activist base going for that.
No, well, it's difficult, and actually, people who take the sort of the counter view, if they all join the Conservative Party, then they may yet get a vote in the election. The activist base clearly take a sort of particular view at the moment. But I come back to the point I made earlier, which is actually it wasn't so long ago that a leader did step forward. David Cameron wasn't always in tune with the activist base of the party, but he said, here's my vision, here's where I want to go, and I will win. And the membership looked at actually somebody who was more like them at the time, David Davis, and they said, no, actually, we like this person over here. So I suppose I'm a little bit of an optimist that actually these things sort of are possible, they can work out.
Which is where a second referendum position would help, in a sense, because if you can establish the position, and I think, by the way, that in many ways, if you are a Remainer, you kind of want Boris, because as we were saying earlier, Boris has the capacity, he has the kind of shamelessness to basically say, look, nobody wants this compromise in the middle, they want hard Brexit or Remain, but if you want hard Brexit, we do have to have a referendum. That's the position. That would get through Parliament, because Remainers would vote for it because they want a second referendum, and hard Brexit people would vote for it because they think they might win. And then in a way, we're kind of at one leap, we're out of it. Now the question then is, what happens in that referendum? And I think you would also, it's very important then that you have a leader who is able to say, look, as a country, we have to manage this referendum better than we managed the last one. The way we're going to conduct this, the way in which we're going to regulate this, so that whatever comes out of this, we have to think not just about what the outcome of the referendum is going to be, but we have to think about how we're going to feel afterwards. I mean, my view about David Cameron, by the way, is that he is as much to blame for not having a plan for what happened if he lost the referendum as he was for calling the referendum in the first place. And that should, for one thing, we must believe about our political elite is if there is a second referendum, they will have a plan for what happens on either outcome the day after.
Matthew, Chris, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts today. Cheers.